In the winter of 1939, after demanding the annexation of several pieces of land and being refused, the USSR, a new industrial powerhouse, bombs its own border guard station, blames it on its western neighbor Finland, and promptly attacks. The valiant and patriotic reaction that surged from the tiny nation stunned both the Soviet Union and the world. The militia that Finland pieced together held off the Red Army for 104 days, and it set the standard for winter warfare for decades to come. By the signing of a peace treaty on March 13th, the USSR had deployed 1.2 million soldiers against a country whose entire population totaled 3.7. When the weapons were laid down and the Red Army vacated Finland, the Finnish had lost a tenth of their land, a 13th of their economy, and most of their national pride, but they had done the USSR a huge favor. Without the Winter War, the USSR would not have been prepared for Nazi Germany's invasion over a year later. It was the embarrassment the Red military suffered during that winter that sparked them to turn their army into a modern fighting machine. Because of Finland's lack of compromise and tenacity during the conflict of the Winter War, the Soviet Union did not crumble under the invasion of their land by Hitler's forces during World War II.
In December of 1917, Russian head of government Vladimir Lenin approved a declaration of independence from the Grand Duchy of Finland, and suddenly 130,000 square miles of land became its own country. They did surprisingly well in a world where countries were rushing to industrialize. Finland caught on quickly. By 1939, they had paid off 90% of their debt, had built a non-fascist, non-communist government that was functioning well, and to top it all off, the 1940 Winter Olympic Games had been scheduled to have been held in Helsinki, Finland's capital. The country had begun preparations with Finnair and a stadium. Finland had managed the impossible, a perfect country, and now they could show it off.
The USSR had a different story to tell. After the Russian Revolution, the premier of the Union, Joseph Stalin, had purged the military of all its most experienced officers in order to eliminate all his potential political rivals. The full scar left by this decision was evident for decades afterwards. In 1939, Stalin realized that an attack from Hitler's Nazi Germany would ravage his country.
Joseph Stalin knew the invasion was coming. It is very specifically, I think, to protect Leningrad.
He diverted money towards the defense budget and structured the border control. In a frantic effort, he bullied the countries on his west border into helping his cause. Estonia cedes a few islands and territories on September 28th, Latvia a week later, Lithuania a week after that, and finally Russia turns to Finland. The demands are simple. Stalin demands a slice of the Karelian Isthmus, the island of Koivisto, the island of Hogland, and a slice of land to the north next to Petsamo, plus a 30-year lease of a military base at Hango. In return, the USSR offered territory north of Lake Ladoga. They invited Director of Finland's National Bank and future president Juuso Paasikivi to Moscow to talk. It seemed that Finland was ready to give all of the land except the Karelian Isthmus and the base at Hango, which would break its policy of neutrality. The talks proceeded for 34 days, and at the end there was no agreement. The USSR's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, Vyacheslav Molotov, said, "We civilians seem unable to accomplish anything more. Now it is up to the military to have their say."
Carl Gustav Mannerheim was expelled from military cadet school when he was 14, but that did not stop him in his pursuit of high military honor. He enrolled in the Russian army when he was 20 and took part in wars against Japan, Poland, and the First World War. At the end of his career in the Red Army, he was a lieutenant general, the equivalent of a modern-day American brigadier general, and had received the Cross of St. George, the highest award a Soviet officer could make. After his career in the Red Army, he went back to his homeland of Finland to live in retirement.
That didn't happen. During the Russian Civil War, some extremists hid out on the Finnish side of the border. Finland's parliaments put Mannerheim in charge of expelling these illegal stowaways, disarming 40,000 Soviet troops and ending the short rebellion they caused in Finland. After a fallout with Parliament, he gave some military advice, worked with the Red Cross, and eventually was named Field Marshal. He later crafted his biggest achievement, the Mannerheim Line.
101 concrete bunkers spread across the Karelian Isthmus from the Gulf of Finland to Lake Ladoga. The Mannerheim Line was the Field Marshal's brainchild. It was built in 2 constructions, and while it was a main reason that the Finns held the Red Army off for so long, it was weak.
Field Marshal Mannerheim was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Finnish Army. While it would be easy to say that his task was to stop the Red armed forces from conquering Finland, the men of the Finnish government were realists. Finland had 2 potential military movements, both for a war against the USSR. Venehan Kesketis I, which means Russian centering, was the first plan and assumed the enemy was fighting other countries on other fronts. But VK2 was more realistic, built for the Soviet invasion of Finland with no help. Since the country had been in a state of emergency since October 10th, Mannerheim initiated VK2 and tried to salvage a war that was certainly almost lost before it even started.
The Finnish army was built of 337,000 men. 1/3 of Finnish soldiers were sent into the war with only what they had from home and nothing more. The country had 112 functioning anti-tank guns, less than 100 flyable planes, and virtually no ammunition. A sizable portion of the weaponry Finland used was given to them by other countries. Plus, all of their communication was made up of runners. It was easy to see why Stalin initially thought he would bulldoze over the Finnish border in only 14 days.
Finland did have a few advantages over the USSR. First of all, the Finnish army knew the lay of the land. They had white winter camouflage and their coats were heavy. The Soviet troops brought from Ukraine, the Baltic states, and Mongolia were not used to the Finnish winter, and their green coats were thin and made it easy to be spotted by Finnish snipers. Finland was also a country of patriots. And it was very mobile. The Finnish soldiers operated and moved about in an unusual way for the Soviets. They skied into battle. Every Finn could ski and every Finn owned skis. The Soviets brought in from the southern part of the Union found skiing hard, and the Soviet army slowed to a crawl compared to the Finns.
The Soviets had some other problems too. While they had control of the air from day one, only 25% of the days in a Finnish winter are suitable for flight. Plus, the Red Army, Navy, and Air Force operated independently with virtually no communication, making each other's attacks more ineffective. On top of that, Stalin's Great Purge of 1936 to 1938 had killed off all senior officers who would have known how to handle the war, so the majority of the Red Army's officers were inexperienced.
Executed or sent to a gulag or just decommissioned on some level.
You can imagine Stalin's face when on February 24th, 87 days after they first invaded the country, Soviet troops broke through the Finnish lines and captured Koivisto. It had been a rough winter, and after a sloppy mid-December attempt to penetrate the Mannerheim line, the Red Army had suffered heavy casualties. Stalin completely ditched one of his 4 original fronts, mid-Finland, where he had planned to slice the country in half, and his battalions to the north had only done mildly well.
And logically, the Soviet Union thinks it's going to win that war, right? So these are just the Finns.
On February 12th, the Soviet Supreme Military Council met, and 4 days after that, the Treaty of Moscow was signed, ending the Winter War. Russia got everything they asked for, plus a large portion of the Karelian Isthmus, including Finland's second largest city, Viipuri, at the price of honor and glory. The world had watched as the world's largest army was humiliated by a ragtag militia. The Soviet Union had to slink back and train. They trained engineers and replaced all of their outdated signal equipment. They trained some of their forces to ski, and they manufactured new coats and new tanks. They modernized and turned themselves from just a large force into a large fighting force.
It was the training and preparations that resulted from the Winter War that saved Russia from being decimated by the German forces more than a year later. Hitler's Operation Barbarossa brought the Union to the brink, and without the modern warfare experience they had gained in the winter of 1939, they most certainly would not have developed into the superpower they were later in the 1900s. Finland ended up losing 11% of its land and 13% of its economy. The 1940 Winter Olympic Games were cancelled due to World War II. The Finnish army joined forces with the German invaders and fought for 3 more years in the Continuation War. Then, when German forces refused to leave northern Finland, Finland engaged them in the Lapland War, meaning that Finland would have been for, and then against, and then for the general interests of the Allied power in World War II. Finland did not win the Winter War, and on paper they gave a lot to the Soviet Union. But in reality, they gave even more, in experience, in drive, and in a heavy dose of reality. Without the lessons of the Winter War of 1939, the USSR would have buckled under German battery and never become the modern fighting superpower that dominated the 20th century.